Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Kratz. For those who don't know, I'm the director of the Center for Asian Studies here at the University of Texas at Dallas. This evening is the first formal presentation of a new series based on the presence that if you want to understand another culture, one of the first places you should look is its fiction and ask its storytellers, read its stories. Our speaker today, Jai Chakrabarti, will be joined later this month. We'll be bringing in two short story writers in November, Sinja Banu and Nina McGonigal, two other Indian American writers. And in January, a lecture that was postponed from earlier this month, Chitra Diva Karuni will be talking and actually give the inaugural lecture. This evening's presentation is supported by several other organizations. We're grateful to the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies for their support. Everything that we do in collaboration with the Crow Museum of Asian Art. And also I want to thank two very special people whose support has helped this program and the Center for Asian Studies, and me personally for many years, Jeff Robinson and Stephanie Schneidler, who are now embarrassed. Okay. They're the ones avoiding standing up. Jai Chakrabarti was born in Calcutta and came to the United States as a child. Okay. And as I think about introducing him, the point of this introduction is there could not be a more appropriate person to speak at UTD and the Bass School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology, a university dedicated to bringing together the sciences and the arts and the humanities, and also bringing together cultures. So one thing I learned from meeting with Jai was that hold this in your mind, he's been writing stories since he was 6 years old. So keep that in mind. He came to America when his parents, who were both professors, took academic appointments in the United States. And now here comes the multiple coincidences. They were philosophers, professors of philosophy, so humanities. Jai, being the son of philosophers, was encouraged, apparently, not to become a philosopher. So he was trained in computer science and became a computer scientist for a while. His sister is an astrophysicist. So we have the humanities and the sciences. But he was writing stories all this time. He met his wife, who was a poet, through their mutual love of music. Okay. And his works, as you will see, reflect that musical element in his life. Well, though trained as a computer scientist, ultimately he knew what he wanted to be in life, and that was a writer. So he rediscovered and lived by that first love, which is writing stories, and that's why he's here. Okay. Now this is a moment, and I'd like all of you to just pause for a moment and think about people that you care about, and think about the common thread of humanity that links us all across multiple cultures, and yet too often melts away in the heat of hatred and passion. So just pause for a moment and think about the better angels of our nature. That common connection and those better angels are the essence of Jai Chakrabarti's stories, what bring people together across cultures, people like him from one culture living in another, torn between two demands and trying to fuse them into harmony. He does it brilliantly, but I won't say anything more other than if you haven't read the books, read the books, and like me, wait eagerly for him to finish what he's working on now. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jai Chakrabarti.
What a generous introduction. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you, Sharon, Olivia, the Center for Asian Studies. Thank you, Jeff and Stephanie, and everyone who's made this such a hospitable visit. It's been great being here with you all, and thank you for coming out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this topic here, writing from our many bodies, narratives of diaspora and home. And then I'm just going to read a little bit from one of my stories, and I'm hoping we can have a discussion too afterwards. To anyone who's crossed a border in search of home is the dedication of my first novel. This dedication is personal for me and also highlights what is core to my aesthetic as a storyteller. But what is a border and what is home? And how do these questions relate to our being people of diaspora, or writers, or readers, or humans in the world today? Most importantly, what does it mean to write from our many bodies? In our time together, I'll talk about these questions and share a little more about my own journey. The word diaspora comes from the Greek, meaning a scattering or a dispersion. When I think about this interpretation, I imagine a bag of precious gems turned upside down, released onto the earth. What we see when the stones fall is a scattering of color and beauty, a dispersion of form. One of the ways ancient India referred to the Greeks who traveled with Alexander the Great was through the Sanskrit word Yavana, which is a way of saying Ionian, referring to the island where most of the Greeks of that day came to India from. For a while in India, Yavana also meant foreigner. What the Greeks learned is that crossing a border means accepting an identity as a foreigner, a label of separation. My maternal grandparents fled what is now Bangladesh and crossed over into Kolkata, India. They came from the farming region of Moymanshing, where the land nurtured and provided, and settled into the metropolis of Kolkata, where to make a living my grandfather opened a tea stall, which for a while paid the rent for 15 people living together in a 3-bedroom apartment. Though they spoke Bengali, ostensibly also the language of their new home, my grandparents were still foreigners. They had little money, differing customs, and the kind of accent that gave them away as refugees. Over the years, they had to make an altered life, scattering what they'd learned into the city where their sweat and breath would become part of the stones and walkways, the story of immigrants everywhere who change a place just by living there. Decades later, I was born in the same city that welcomed my grandparents. And I spent my early childhood attending a school that you can find in the Guinness Book of World Records for the greatest number of students with, at peak, 15,500 children. Despite our numbers, South Point School was committed to the arts, and we read the works of classical and contemporary literature, including the work of Rabindranath Tagore, who is sometimes compared to Shakespeare in terms of his literary contribution. Tagore was the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature and wrote volumes of short stories, many novels, collections of plays, books of poems, and essays on politics and philosophy. One of Tagore's plays, Dakghar, is at the center of my first novel, a play for the end of the world. This play is about a dying child, Amal, who, on account of his health, must quarantine in his home and experiences the world through his window, cultivating a defiant imagination. Though I'd read and even performed in this play as a child, it wasn't until years later that I would come to appreciate its layers of meaning. Oddly enough, it was Israel that provided this opportunity, where I was a foreigner. I'd been living in Jerusalem at the time with my wife, the poet Ilana Bell, who was working on her first book of poems, Eyes Stones, an exploration of the complicated interweave of history of Israel and Palestine and how two narratives can exist in one body. It was our last day in Jerusalem when we visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial, an especially meaningful visit for Ilana, who is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Her grandmother, Zosha, was liberated from Auschwitz, moved to a displaced persons camp, then spent a year in Israel before finally emigrating to Los Angeles, where she made a beautiful life. What I would come to learn that day at Yad Vashem was that Dakkar, sometimes translated in English as the post office, had been performed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 by a group of orphans weeks before deportations to Treblinka. The orphanage's director was a man named Janusz Korczak, who, despite offers from influential friends, refused to leave his children behind. Learning of this history changed my life. Here was a meeting of two diasporas, the Jewish and the Indian, finding solace in the worst of times through art and art making. For the next several years, I researched the history of this play and its performance in Warsaw, and traveled to Poland and to Shantiniketan, the village in India where it was originally composed by Tagore. From this immersion, the seed of an idea for a novel arose. Over the course of 30 years, I followed a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, Jarek, from Poland to New York to India, traversing the history of that time, but more importantly, as is the case for many novels I love, Jarek's emotional history from childhood to midlife. To do this work, I had to write into bodies that are not my own. I had to find ways to become intimate with Jarek and with Lucy, his lover from the American South. I am not from Poland. I was born long after World War II. And though I've lived in the South, I am not of the South in the way Lucy is, nor do we share the same gender. The act of achieving intimacy with Jarek and Lucy and with characters in our fiction is a profound and I'd like to think sometimes even a mystical process. There's a short poem by Robert Bly called The Third Body that invokes this concept. A man and a woman sit near each other, and they do not long at this moment to be older or younger, nor born in any other nation or time or place. They are content to be where they are, talking or not talking. Their breaths together feed someone whom we do not know. The man sees the way his fingers move. He sees her hands close around a book she hands to him. They obey a third body that they share in common. They've made a promise to love that body. Age may come, parting may come, death will come. A man and a woman sit near each other. As they breathe, they feed someone we do not know, someone we know of, whom we have never seen. Bly wrote this poem capturing the closeness that can develop over time between lovers, and I like to think about this concept in the relationship between a writer and their characters, the third body as what we strive to inhabit when we are writing fiction, when we are imagining lives that are not our own. This is delicate, sometimes dangerous work. How can you do this thoughtfully? How can you even know what it is like inside the mind of another person? A dove on a stone is an image from one of Jory Graham's poems, I'm Reading Your Mind Again. This is how I think about the act of imagining ourselves inside another person's consciousness. We might briefly alight, we might see something beautiful, and then we're back into our own morass. But try this again and again and again, and maybe you have a path to intimacy. I feel it rise in me, the word. I feel the skull beneath the skin. I feel the skin slick and shine and hide the skull, and it is from there that it rises now. I taste it before I say it, this song. Writes Jory Cram. There is a way then that the word and the song might help us feel less foreign to each other, might help us close the border between you and I, or as Martin Buber might have said it, I and thou. In an I and thou relationship, individuals engage with each other on a deep personal and relational level. There's a notion of encounter here that's vital. We're meeting each other as equals with curiosity, with a hopeful sense of discovery. If there is a spiritualist in me, it is here, waiting in the source of human connections, where I feel each one of us may be transformed in the space of a single ordinary day, simply through the interactions we have with one another, if we can believe those interactions are exalted. Sometimes I'm asked about my process of writing, and I'll reveal that for first drafts that I forsake an outline. There are many writers I admire and respect who do outline, and not doing so may ultimately make me a slower writer. A play for the end of the world took 10 years. But the reason I don't map out what happens next in a novel or a story is because at one level I want to be surprised by my own subconscious. At another, maybe more spiritual level, I want to be open to what happens when I'm in an I and thou relationship with my characters. I want to learn about the third body between us, its grudges and secrets, the ways in which the third body isn't telling me or the reader the most important thing, and to learn of this most important thing, you have to be willing to visit the same dilapidated diner many nights in a row, order everything on the menu, make small talk the first dozen times, and only on the umpteenth time might the waiter reveal an unguarded laugh that suggests something of his childhood, something about the way he might hold another person. There's a short story by Tobias Wolff called Bullet in the Brain. It's about an ornery, old book critic by the name of Anders. Throughout his career, Anders has been known for the savagery by which he trashes almost everything he reviews, a trait he carries into his personal life, and the story begins in a bank. There's a heist going on with robbers who mean business, but Anders refuses to play along, criticizing the way one of the robbers uses vulgar language. Even as he has a gun on him, Anders can't help but mock the use of the word capiche and is shot in the head. What follows is, in my opinion, one of the finest sections of speculative short fiction, a look inside Anders' head, a visit to his childhood and a remembrance of something joyful. These are the last two paragraphs of that story. Then the last two boys arrive, Coyle and a cousin of his from Mississippi. Anders has never met Coyle's cousin before and will never see him again. He says hi with the rest, but takes no further notice of him until they've chosen sides, and Darsh asks the cousin what position he wants to play. Shortstop, the boy says. Short's the best position they is. Anders turns and looks at him. He wants to hear Coyle's cousin repeat what he's just said, but he knows better than to ask. The others will think he's being a jerk, ragging the kid for his grammar. But that isn't it. Not at all. It's that Anders is strangely roused, elated by those final two words, their pure unexpectedness and their music. He takes the field in a trance, repeating them to himself. The bullet is already in the brain. It won't be outrun forever or charmed to a halt. In the end, it will do its work and leave the troubled skull behind, dragging its comet's tail of memory and hope and talent and love into the marble hall of commerce. That can't be helped. But for now, Anders can still make time. Time for the shadows to lengthen on the grass, time for the tethered dog to bark at the flying ball, time for the boy in right field to smack his sweat-blackened mitt and softly chant, "They is, they is, they is." This, then, is intimacy with a character. The moment of surprise. Until these paragraphs, we see Anders as a type, a snobbish book critic who has spent his life criticizing others. But this final moment changes everything. It creates another body for Anders to inhabit, a body that is profoundly complex and all the more beautiful. The process I've adopted over the years, the process that takes me closer to the third body between myself and a character, is journaling. I keep a section of a journal for each of my characters, and when I'm working on a story, I'll begin my writing section by writing in their voice, asking them a series of questions I've cultivated over the years, a few mundane questions about their first job, first romantic partner, things like that, and other questions that cut deeper, questions about their belief in God, for example, or when and how they first felt shame. What I'm doing here is a kind of channeling, not so much of others, but of myself, of how I have been in the world, the ways in which I might have suspected some inner truth, a casual interaction at a gas station or a long relationship with a friend. All of these are churned up and turned into the life of a single character, and the third body begins to develop when I take this relationship seriously. Writing about people who are not us is challenging work, and the results can sometimes be problematic. How do we know if we're doing this with integrity? In her essay, Fascinated to Presume, in defense of fiction, Zadie Smith writes, "Most of us have love for and interest in our own lives, our quote-unquote own people. Our lives are nonfiction. This is my family, my neighborhood, my body, my reality. Fiction as a mode shared this love and interest, but always with the twist of, well, fiction. I was always interested not only in how things are, but also in how things might be otherwise. I once wrote a novel about an imaginary, multi-hyphenated British, Jewish, Chinese boy. It was love and interest that motivated me, but my love and interest was located in the other. In my case, love of and interest in Judaism and Buddhism, two systems of thought in which I have no birthright." Smith goes on to introspect Walt Whitman's famous lines, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." These lines have long been a clarion call for writers everywhere. From one person, the whole universe. From one jumbled story, the story of our broken world. But what does it mean to contain multitudes? There's something about the word contain that evokes imprisonment or dominion, a relationship of power. Smith is arguing passionately in defense of a fiction where a writer may write about subjects outside of their own cultural, racial, and personal milieu, as it were, but she is also providing a cautionary backstop. Even as we may acknowledge the way in which fiction provides us this beautiful expanse, we must also acknowledge that writing about others has been a way that marginalized groups have been contained by limiting narratives. A small example of this containment is what sometimes has been described as the quote-unquote mangoes and monkeys strain of Indian American literature. There was a time when if a book was set in India but didn't contain references to either mangoes or monkeys, it might not make the publisher's shortlist in America. As someone who enjoys eating mangoes and has had many encounters with monkeys in India, I can see how these books described a version of the country of my birth. But of course, this is not the only India. Certainly not the only Indian American experience, which in this country at least generally doesn't consist of either mangoes or monkeys. Eventually, a more complex look into Indian life in India and abroad would be explored by writers like Jhumpa Lahiri and Akhil Sharma, and more recently by writers like Shastri Akela and Nawaz Ahmed. These authors break away from a prevalent narrative. Telling and retelling stories is the work of a writer. When I think about some of the writers I love, I see a through line, sometimes even an obsession with a single question. One of those questions for me is, What does it mean to cross borders and cultivate family? For those of us who have crossed a border, we might feel we are inhabiting a different body in our newfound country, that the way the bones and fascia work is changed and altered. There's a physicality to the transition, I think. Even sunsets are different. In the Northeast, where I now live, the summer sunsets are long and languid, but in India at the same time of year, they're more fleeting, thanks to geography and the position of the equator. A faster or slower sunset may not be so notable, but it affects the body nonetheless, changes the way we respond to the tides, the way we exist in the world. It is then with our newfound bodies that we find our sense of family and define what home means to us. For many years, my wife and I struggled to conceive. To make our home, we yearned for another being to join us. And after many visits to a fertility clinic, in what felt then and now as a miraculous stroke, we conceived naturally, though once the child came, we felt wholly unprepared for it in our tiny Brooklyn apartment, not only because of the lack of space, but also because we were alone, the two adults and at times the inscrutable infant. We were far away from our biological families, and to bridge the gap, we called on our chosen family, poets, musicians, and artists mainly, who in the way of extended families of my parents' generation provided a continuous supply of attention and love. In my collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, I explore the emotional turbulence of this period, seeking to understand my own relationship to being a parent and to also being parented, puzzling through my experience of childhood and questions of home by living vicariously through my characters' bodies, who are in their own ways flawed, as I am. So when I sit down to journal in my characters' voices, I'm connecting to someone I know of but have never seen. Thought by bone and thought, I'm making space to connect to others in the world. In some way, I think every story is a retelling in some fashion. We write through the anxieties of influence and consciously or unconsciously re-explore the stories we love. For me, there's been no larger literary influence than Rabindranath Tagore. As I spoke of earlier, Tagore's Dakhor plays a pretty big role in my first novel, but it was his most famous short story called Kabuliwala that I explored in the same medium. The Tagore original is often regarded as one of his finest and most emotionally complex stories, and it follows the relationship of an Afghani merchant and a family in Kolkata whom the merchant befriends. The merchant, the so-called Kabuliwala, strikes up a friendship with a little girl, though over the years this relationship frays as the girl gets older and the Kabuliwala is kept away, as he imagines his own daughter in Afghanistan, to whom he must now be a stranger. Tagore's story is told from the point of view of the girl's father, but I wanted to explore this from the point of view of the one who'd crossed the border, so to speak, the Kabuliwala himself. The last story in my collection, The Fortunes of Others, which I'll read from in a little bit, does exactly this. It doesn't follow the plot of the Tagore story, but it is about an Afghani merchant, though in my case the Kabuliwala comes to adopt a boy who lives by the train tracks. Their unusual connection and the sacrifice that the Kabuliwala must ultimately make is the stuff of parenting everywhere. As the poet David White says, being a good parent will necessarily break our hearts as we watch a child grow and eventually choose their own way, even through many of the same heartbreaks we have traversed. So, in the last few moments, I've been making a case for why writing into bodies that are not our own is a worthy endeavor. I make this case at a time where it's no longer only human bodies, but also machines that are capable of creating fiction. We have unleashed the ability for computational models to train on vast amounts of data and to generate stories. I say this not only as a writer, but also as a computer scientist, as someone who once worked in a research lab developing neural networks, the technology that is foundational to systems like ChatGPT. While there are many positive applications of the technology, we also must acknowledge that the stories created by machines aren't lived stories, which is to say that they're not from bodies. The body, as Bessel van der Kolk writes, is what keeps the score. It's the body that experiences the joy of sunlight after many days of rain, the body that recoils before a snake in the woods, the body that knows how to cradle an infant skin to skin. Stories are made of scars, of the simple and profound disappointments we endure, of the ways in which we age and grow closer to our deaths. When we leave the storytelling to machines, we run the risk of extinguishing our imaginations. What a system like ChatGPT lacks is the bodily experience of growing old and moving toward finality. And while what it produces might be compelling and even surprising, it cannot serve to awaken our own deepest imagination. For that, we have to be willing to sit quietly, to rummage and experience in memory for the spark, and to follow that spark wherever it may go. When I say I worry about the crisis of the imagination, I mean that I worry that we will not write from our bodies, those vessels that carry the encyclopedias of our joys and suffering. So I invite us in radical and collective action to take up the pen, to take up the book, and to sit with one another as we co-create how we evolve as a human race. It is through writing into our bodies, imagining the third body between ourselves and one or more people, that I believe we become more human, more capable of joy and grief, more capable of falling more in love. And as I end here, I want to read a little bit from that last short story, The Fortunes of Others. And I'm going to read from the ending section here. And what you need to know is that the Kabuliwala has adopted this little boy from the train tracks. This was years ago. And they're living together in Varanasi, which is a famous town in India. It's sometimes called the city of death. It's where people go to die. And they have made their home there. And the Kabuliwala sells statues, religious statues, even though he's not religious. And he's found a customer by the name of Hannah, who is their major customer. And she's taken a real interest to this adopted boy by the name of Sundar. So I'm just going to read the last couple of pages from that story. And they've been invited to dinner together at a restaurant. So this begins with the restaurant scene. The restaurant in question was not the one frequented by visitors to the monastery. Instead, it was next to a 5-star hotel on the riverbank, close to where the minions gathered for the evening arti. For the occasion, the Kabuliwala had washed and ironed Sundar's one good shirt. He'd done the same for his own outfit. Though he lacked Western clothing, he'd carried a sea blue kurta his father had worn from country to country. He trimmed his beard, oiled his hair, and fastened the buttons of his kurta. Now he was older than his father had been when the Taliban had come to take the capital. Now he had a boy of his own who tried to insist on bringing his stuffed toy, though the Kabuliwala said it wouldn't be proper. Arun will watch Tiger Friend, the Kabuliwala said. The mutt bared his teeth to confirm this duty. They walked hand in hand to the restaurant by the river. Without Arun at their side and with their clothes specially chosen for the occasion, the Kabuliwala believed they were as respectable as any father and son pair. "What did you learn at school today?" the Kabuliwala asked, feeling a little giddy. "The ring of fire," the boy said, "the place of many volcanoes and earthquakes." What strange, delightful subjects his boy was learning. In the future, he would try to send Sundar to school at least 2 days a week. And each night, he would ask about the discoveries of the day. The Kabuliwala couldn't read, but in other ways, he could still help his boy with school. Hannah was waiting for them outside the restaurant. She seemed pleased to see them so finely dressed, though she herself had come in a white t-shirt and jeans, which he found odd and a little upsetting, given how much care the waiters of the restaurant would give to the serving of the food, how rare an experience it was for Sundar and himself. "You must be hungry. Come with me." She took Sundar by the hand and left the Kabuliwala to follow. The restaurant was cavernous, 2 stories full with the conversations of foreigners and well-dressed Indians, a stylized English in the air, which along with the perfume of many bodies left the Kabuliwala feeling lightheaded. They were seated by the window where they had a view of the water, all that current evident through the haze of the settling dusk, the priests wading in to stir their prayers into the water, the tourists gathering by the shore to witness. First, there was bread, with the crusts hard but the innards soft. The Kabuliwala tried to eat slowly. Across the table, Hannah watched them. From time to time, she spoke, and he tried his best to understand. Sometimes he would look to his boy for help, and Sundar would whisper into his ear, "She was asking about business," or "She wants to know how you came here." "Good," he said. "So long ago," he said, relieved that he could find the phrases in English. Mostly it was his boy and Hannah talking, exchanging phrases in English rapidly as if they were playing a sport. With all of the other conversations in the room and the sight of those priests in the water readying for the evening prayer, the Kabuliwala found their talk difficult to follow. He didn't complain, because food appeared without his having to worry. For his boy, there was pasta with tomato sauce, and for him, Hannah had ordered a dish of curried lamb, the sauce thick with cream and coriander. He thought he would need to show his boy how to use a fork. But Sundar already knew the pasta, a familiar friend, which he scarfed down with no reservation. Watching his adopted son, the Kabuliwala felt that Hannah and Sundar had done this before. He'd always assumed that they only walked around the neighborhood during their afternoon sojourns, but perhaps they'd feasted at this very restaurant without the Kabuliwala knowing, the boy's belly full with delicacies as he returned home and was offered a bowl of puffed rice, a cup of tea. He'd always thought the boy told him everything. But as he watched Sundar roll pasta with a fork, he conceded his ignorance. He looked at the table next to them, where a group of men with gelled hair and blue suits drank from long-stemmed glasses. They'd hardly taken a bite of their kebabs. One of them laughed with the delicateness of a caged bird. They were all doing their best to ignore him, his blemished face, his robber's beard. With his outstretched arm, he could have knocked a glass off the table, stopped their mirth in its tracks. The lamb on his plate began to taste sour. "Something wrong?" Hannah asked. "Beta, I am feeling a little sick," the Kabuliwala told the boy. "He is already full," the boy said in English. "But we haven't even had dessert," Hannah said. "No need," the Kabuliwala said. Though he wondered what sweet treats lay hidden in the kitchen, he watched as his boy slurped the last of the sauce from his plate. "They have the best ice cream," Hannah said. "Baba, please," his boy said. At least tonight, he hadn't needed to worry their meal to life. Maybe he would take the scraps of lamb back to the mutt. His boy was bursting with gladness. But for him, sitting through the meal had felt like a kind of reckoning. The men at the next table, the waiters, everyone they'd passed had given him the same look. He wasn't meant to be here, to be among the rich, and never was he to return. But the boy hadn't noticed. He remained eager to have his treat. What kind do they have?" the Kabuliwala finally asked, consenting for Sundar's sake on dessert. 12 flavors. My favorite is pistachio. Hannah signaled to the waiter, and soon they each had a bowl of pistachio ice cream. The Kabuliwala had carried pistachios early in his trade, tiny burlap bags full of the exquisite drupes, some shelled and salted, others roasted and honeyed, but he'd never tasted ice cream with pistachios. He took a good whiff to confirm the invention before him. What was it the boy had that first day together? Chocolate and vanilla? That was right. Hands dark and sticky with sweetness. Some had gotten into Sundar's hair, leading to a cowlick that remained for days. The waiter brought the bill and Hannah slipped him a card without checking the amount. "There's a question I have to ask you," she said. The Kabuliwala waited, uncertain if she was expecting to be thanked for the meal, if he'd missed some note of etiquette. "I'm returning to America," Hannah said. "Sundar's told me his story. I want to take him home with me. Will you let me?" The Kabuliwala wasn't sure if he'd understood, so he looked to Sundar for help. Word by word, the boy rendered the message in their own language. He was squinting at the Kabuliwala as he said, "Will you let me?" What a question to consider over a meal. What a strange question to even ask at all. He had suspected that Hannah's affections for the boy were strong, but couldn't have imagined this precipice. "Will you let me?" The boy's words played through his head and left his throat unbearably dry. It took him several moments to understand the import. During his silence, he could feel the men at the next table pause their conversation to eavesdrop. He wanted to roar, give them all the benefit of his voice, but his throat was parched. "No," he finally muttered, repeating it to be sure he was heard. He watched Hannah's face grow old, hearing his answer. Then he stared at her bowl of ice cream. As the ice cream melted, his heart softened. What wonders his son could learn in her homeland, from the lives of frogs to the lives and fortunes of others. He looked to his son, as serious as when he studied for his exams. "Baba," his little boy whispered, "you can come too. So can Arun." "Maybe," said the Kabuliwala. "I think more. Now we go home." The color returned to Hannah's face. "I'm here another week. There are things to be sorted out, but I'll come back for him. Promise you'll think it over?" He nodded. He'd meant to ask her to replace the boy's school book, but now that request felt out of place. When they left the restaurant, they found Arun the mutt waiting outside with Sundar's stuffed tiger in his mouth. He had a good nose, which meant he could have found them a city away. When Sundar took his toy, Arun sighed and barked a wistful hello. Hannah shook the Kabuliwala's hand. "You'll let me know?" she asked. He nodded. When she retreated toward the monastery, she walked with hunched back into the unfamiliar dusk, a smaller version of the person who now loomed so large in their life. That evening, he and the boy and the dog watched the arti by the riverbank. It was an ancient ceremony, older even than the journey of merchants from Kabul to the cities of Hindustan. A dozen priests had rolled up their dhotis and were wading in the water, waving candles and humming scripture. He had no room for God in his heart, but there was beauty with all the lights in the water. When he squeezed Sundar's hand, his boy squeezed back. Even if he was invited, he was too old for another country. But this boy beside him, this fast talker, this learner of words, this bearer of many fires, would experience worlds he couldn't imagine. "Baba," Sundar said, "why don't we come here more often?" "Don't know," the Kabuliwala said. All this time that they'd lived in Varanasi, they'd mostly missed this daily ceremony by the river, the song sending the paper lanterns into the sea. It had been many years since he'd seen Kabul, the beauty of its blue veils, every so often a street opening to a glimpse of the mountains. But this was a country of water. In making this second life, he'd once again come to believe that love could not be taken. until this hour, as the paper boats with their blessings burned into the tide, it had seemed like a good myth to live by. Thank you all so much. All right. Bring the microphone. Yes.
Does anybody have a question for Jai? I have one to start. Your description of your relationship with the characters, asking what they like and where they're from, and do they stay with you? I mean, as a writer, you live with these characters, and as you were talking, I was wondering what happens to them when the book is over. One of my favorite stories of plays is Six Characters in Search of an Author, when the characters come back and say, we're not finished with you yet. So my question is, as a writer, what happens to the characters that you've lived with for so long?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so the characters in my first novel, who I spent a long time with, I feel that I could have dinner with them tonight. You know, I feel we could have a conversation because it's been hundreds of pages of journals and so many revisions. And I think where they are now is largely as they were when I was writing the book. And you know, people ask me from time to time, will I go back to them? And I generally don't feel the calling to do so, even though I know writers like Elizabeth Strout and so many folks these days are kind of coming back to the same characters over and over again. But I don't know, I suppose I'm interested in meeting more and more people and extending my friends circle a little bit more by imagining more characters. So for now, they are as they are, and I come to them sometimes, and I think, oh, what would Yarick do in this circumstance? But yeah, they still exist in my consciousness.
They're asleep somewhere deep in your soul. Any question? Any other? Yes, back.
Speaking of your characters and building them in the way that you do, and the questions you ask, you mentioned Lucy, the Southern lady, and I wondered how did you do that? Did you have a model of some sort, or how did you get into that body?
Yeah, great question. Well, so I lived in North Carolina when I went to high school, and Lucy is from the town over where I lived. So I had a sense of her language, and I think for me that's probably the most important thing, is the rhythm. What does a person sound like? You know, how would they dance if they were asked to dance? And I felt I had the sense of how Lucy sounded, and that was the most important thing. But yeah, and in some ways, writing her character was a little bit of a relief, because Yarick had this incredible trauma that he was carrying. And so when I could write in Lucy's character, even though, of course, she had gone through her own struggles, it was in a way a kind of coming home from the very sometimes dark sections of Yarick's past. Thank you.
Other?
That was beautiful. I enjoyed the reading. I was wondering, as you were talking about immigrants, for instance, you mentioned your wife's grandmother who came here, or was it mother or grandmother? I couldn't remember. Who had a beautiful life, and I was thinking, immigrants change or evolve their characters as they blend into the country that they have immigrated to. do you ever think about the evolution of that one character, maybe your parents or other immigrants? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and I think that Jhumpa Lahiri looks at this really thoughtfully in her short fiction. Immigrants who come to this country hold on to a certain set of values. Sometimes those values are impinged upon. Sometimes they are evolved into a new set of ways of being in the world. And I think about it constantly, and not only in the context of immigrants, but just in the context of humans, in the sense that I feel that I'm probably more similar to people, my age than I have in common with my 15-year-old self, right? When I think about my 15-year-old self, I think about someone who, was a very different person. And tracking those changes, I think, is one of the joys of fiction, because you can move through time and really see those evolutions.
Any others? Yes. I'm getting my exercise. This is good.
Thank you. I've read both of your books and enjoyed them thoroughly. Also, in both of the books, there's not a lot of information about you on the flaps, and so I just thought with a play before dying that you must have grown up Jewish. You must have, you must have had relatives in the Holocaust. And so I was really curious to meet you tonight to hear your background. And it's still very surprising. I don't know. That's what I've liked about it is how identifiable for Indian culture and for Jewish culture, really both of your books are. And it seems like even though your wife is Jewish and you've lived in Jerusalem, it's still such a deeper understanding of that. And I understand you looking for this third body and journaling to get to know them better, but it just has been it was really amazing to me how much a part of that was of you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm honored to hear it. Like I mentioned, I think that the story of Janusz Korczak in particular is a story that changed my life, and he just is very, very close to my heart, and so I wanted to do justice to that story, and so I really kind of immersed myself in research. And there was also kind of the relational aspect of being with Zosha, my wife's grandmother, and hearing her specific stories. And I feel that in the end there's more that connects our stories than separates us. So I guess that was the entry point into the book.
And
Thank you. Well, as a fellow Bengali, having grown up in Canada, immigrant parents, both from Kolkata area, I have a question from the historical standpoint, and I've always been curious but never asked, what are the connections historically over time with our Bengali community and the Jewish community? And there's a deep connection there because it's maybe 4 or 5 generations of marital relationships, children that have started off from Jewish and Bengali families, moving around India and then moving elsewhere. It's absolutely fascinating, but I don't know the history. So I wonder if you could enlighten us on that.
Yeah, I don't know if I know specifically about the connections between Bengalis and Jews, but I mean, Jews in India have been around for a very long time, right? So the Jews who came to Cochin came after the destruction of the Second Temple, and they carried with them artifacts from the Second Temple, which tells you how old of a community they were. And before the creation of this of Israel, I mean, there were just so many Jewish communities, not only in Cochin but in Kolkata, in Mumbai, and a number of other places in India. So it was really kind of an enduring relationship, and a complicated one, but I think one that was largely quite positive over a couple thousand years.
Ravi.
Actually, that mention of the Jewish communities in Abraham Verghese' book, The Covenant of Water, he actually states that. But my question was, you said those characters you created still live with you, but perhaps haven't changed. As an immigrant, the home country hasn't changed in my mind, but it has changed. So when I go, I feel alienated. What do you think?
Yes. Yes, so there is the memory of the home country, and then there is the country as it is. And I think that the distance between those two realities can be really stark. And I know from my parents in particular, I mean, they came here for their graduate studies, but they really held on to that version of India as it was when they left for their graduate studies. And so while, some of the other folks in the Indian American community maybe, let's say, evolved in certain ways, my parents didn't. And they remembered and upheld that version of India. So I think it was, it is at times painful for them to encounter that. For me personally, I never felt at home in a place like North Carolina. But I also never felt at home in Kolkata, because even though I spoke, Bengali fluently, and you wouldn't be able to tell, I was only there for 3 months every year, so they knew I was just a passerby. So I kind of had this experience of neither belonging here nor there, which I think has a lot to do with my fiction and why I have come to be a writer. But yeah, that sense of nostalgia, yeah, I feel it, and I think it's profound.
Dr. Harpham.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful reading. I'm struck as a political scientist because the title of the talk, but it's about the diaspora. But we live in a time where everybody seems to be coming from somewhere and nobody's at home. Does that change the position the writer has? You look at Texas right now, for example. When I came here, Houston was a city largely of what we called Anglo-Texans. It's now almost all Latino. There's nothing good or bad about that, it's just the change, but then there's that sort of sense of lost home, just like you're describing, where do you feel home? A lot of people don't feel at home except in their families. Now, do you think that throws you back on the family more? If you were writing about this, for example. My family, my grandfather was from England. My father was from Canada. I'm from Texas. We have nothing sort of in common that you can say is ours. What about the experience for the writer trying to capture that? I mean, it's not just the Indians or the Jews in the 20th century that have migrated across. All of America is that. Italy, when I've been back to Italy. So I'm just curious, is it a different writing experience? There is no diaspora. There's thousands of diasporas, right?
Absolutely, no singular diaspora, and it is changing and becoming more complex every day. I suppose that I do what I always do, which is approach it from the perspective of a single character. And from the perspective of a single character, you have all of the complexities of who that one person is, which, let's say it's somebody who is Latino growing up in Texas. They have that particular bent in their experience. And what I try to do is really kind of focus on them as a person and less on the larger political context. And I try to let the character, through the character, explore what it means to be in the world today in a very quotidian sense, thinking about who they fall in love with, thinking about what they pursue, rather than taking on the question of diasporas more directly. So I guess it's just more an attention to people as they are, the Dangenseich, as Heidegger said, the way things are as they are, rather than thinking about the complex ways that in which you're talking about diasporas
Well,
changing.
let me just follow it just a little bit differently then. The argument is made in many cultural centers that somebody from another culture, much less a writer, can ever grasp what somebody's experiencing and feeling, and they shouldn't. I assume you don't think that's true. Am I putting words in your mouth?
Thanks for the direct question. And so, this is what Zadie Smith encounters in her essay, Fascinated to Presume, in which she talks about how her favorite character is, this British, Chinese, American boy. And I share that same view. I talked about some of the cautionary backstops that we have to pursue, but I think it would be a very limiting view of the world to imagine that we can only write about ourselves. And I understand that in today's publishing environment, that there is immense pressure to write about, quote unquote, our own experiences. But this is a modern phenomenon and not something that literature has been known by for its larger duration. And again, I think it needs to be done thoughtfully. There's a lot to say about that. But I do believe in the fundamental premise of being able to write about the other. I think that's how we build the empathy machine that is us.
Thank you very much.
One last unfair question. Would never know, I don't know about others, but you never know what sentence or what phrase in a work is going to reach out and really grab you. Several years ago, we interviewed virtually another award-winning Asian American author, Charles Yu, was here. In his novel, Interior Chinatown, there's a line, that's what it's like to be Chinese. Always a visiting star, never a member of the ensemble. The story, I can't remember the title, but there's the line from the very Jewish mother: you're either a member of the tribe or you're not. My question to you is, what I think of as an example of the new cosmopolitan human being. You're an Indian American who's embraced Judaism, but dare I say, you don't look Jewish. What is this? To what degree is this mingling an advantage, and to what degree is it a disadvantage? And how do you foresee the future of us mixed folk?
Well, I'm really glad we're ending with such a light question, first of all. I will say that starting from the personal, that for me, immersion into Jewish culture has been one of the great blessings of my life. To be able to learn about Jewish ritual and practice, to study with, a rabbi. How lucky am I to have this experience of another culture? And to do it while I have also, cultivated my love of Indian mythology and Indian philosophy. My parents, being the philosophers, would not have expected otherwise. So for me, it's been immensely rewarding, and I think that those are the benefits. Those are some of the benefits for me. I think some of the challenges are that there's always this question of authenticity, right? And this question of authenticity appears whenever you're reading anything. When you read a book and you check the title and you check the author's name, you're like, well, why is this person writing this? Maybe, and they're writing about your hometown, but you're like, wait a minute, my hometown wasn't like that at all. The fries were much better than they're describing in this book. And so there's always this kind of evaluation of authenticity that readers do, which is important and essential for us to believe a work of fiction, right? That to actually believe that a work of fiction is real in some way. And I think that when we have folks who are between cultures, who are writing about multiple experiences, those questions of authenticity loom even larger. And so I think there is a higher standard, actually, if, let's say, you're not Indian and you're writing about something to do with India, or you're not Jewish and you're writing about something to do with Judaism, there's kind of a higher standard that you have to pursue to get beyond that question of authenticity. So I would say that's one of the main drawbacks.
Thank you, Jai. I think what we've heard is why, one, that we have on our stage a rising star in the literary world, and also an example, I think, of the better world that's going to come. Thank you very much, Jai.